This is Terrence McNally, and this week you'll hear one of my favorite previously recorded interviews with Jeremy Rifkin about his book, The Empathic Civilization, The Race to Global Consciousness in a World in Crisis. We spoke in November 2010. Does it seem to you that the world's people have never been so united in terms of communication, commerce, culture, united and connected? Okay. Now another one. Does it also seem they've never been more in conflict or more threatened in terms of war and violence, financial meltdown and inequity, environmental harms and climate change? Finally, would you agree that when it comes to confronting the challenges of this rapidly globalizing and threatened world, that the human race seems to continually come up short? If, like me, you answer yes to all three, then before you jump from a bridge or a building, stay tuned for the next hour. Today's guest also agrees, and he uses those troubling facts as a jumping-off point, if you will, for what is a truly ambitious book that he calls The Empathic Civilization. In it, best-selling social critic Jeremy Rifkin takes on these challenges and more and ends up painting both a frightening picture of our predicament and a way out. Among many other things, Rifkin says the very way our brains are structured disposes us to a way of feeling, thinking, and acting that is no longer relevant to the new environments we've created. As the forces of globalization accelerate, become more complex, our older faith-based or rational forms of consciousness are going to become stressed and perhaps even dangerous. Can a new, more empathic consciousness emerge and assert power, and can it do it soon enough? If it can, Rifkin believes that has implications for the future that will likely be as profound as when Enlightenment philosophers replaced faith-based consciousness with reason. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, media, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. One of the most popular social thinkers of our time, Jeremy Rifkin, is the best-selling author of The End of Work, The Biotech Century, The Hydrogen Economy, The European Dream. He's a fellow at the Wharton School Executive Education Program at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the president of the Foundation on Economic Trends in Washington, D.C. His newest book is the one we're going to talk about, The Empathic Civilization. Welcome again, Jeremy Rifkin, to Free Forum.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Okay. I like listeners to get a bit of a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work we're going to talk about. So let me ask you this. Over the years, you've written about an amazing range of issues: politics, science, technology, social anthropology, shall we say. How did you develop this eclectic approach, and what holds it all together for you?
You know, I've been a social activist since the mid-1960s, so for me, the journey has been across the disciplines. I've always believed that it's important to both have theory and practice, and that is we need to do our homework. We need to reflect on the big challenges that face us if we're going to be effective in our social activism. So when I began to write books, I was not limited by the traditional academic criteria that you had to be narrow to the discipline and reductionist in your approach. So my books have always been interdisciplinary, and my learning's been that way, and I think it's been very helpful for me to try to find a way to focus on really what are the real challenges facing us and how do we attend to them.
I see.
At least I've tried.
Right. So your drive is what's the big challenge, and what does it really mean? How do I figure it out, and how might we solve it, and wherever that takes you?
Yes, and this book really is the culmination of over 40 years of social activism and intellectual work. I've been thinking about the empathic civilization for at least 25 years, and as you know, there's been little references here and there in my other books, but a little over 6 years ago, I really put myself to the task of seeing how I could synthesize a lifetime of work and make sense to myself as to what this was all about.
Okay, and let me confess, by the way, that I view this interview we're doing right now as a bit daunting, because, I mean, it probably has something to do with those 40 years or 20 years or 25 years, but it takes on so much, and and a range of things that I know that if I asked you one big question, you could probably, and because I've seen you do it, you could probably talk for the entire hour. I want our interviews to be conversations, so I just want to throw that challenge out there for both of us. And as I look at your career, I see that every few years, when I've told people, you do what I think is a big idea book, and as you say, this might be the biggest of your big idea books, and then you do more specific books. One almost every year or so, and then another big foundation challenging one. What finally got you to say it's time to write this one?
Well, I'll tell you why. I advise a number of heads of state around the world, and I've been advising the European Union now for over a decade. And I found in my discussions over the years, at least at the EU level, that there's something deep to the core of the way we define ourselves as a species that's limiting our ability to attend to some of the great challenges facing the human race. Let me start off with a statistic because I think it's telling. My sense is, I'm not sure of this, but my sense is that we may be facing our potential extinction in this century. It's hard to say that. It sounds melodramatic, and there have been so many prophetic, apocalyptic visions over the centuries, and thank God they've all turned out to be wrong. But I'll share a statistic with your listeners, and they can make up their own mind. At the Wharton School where I teach business people, and I say to them, you have to understand the first economy, the primary economy in the world is photosynthesis. Everything's based on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we human beings are the youngest species in the evolutionary scheme of things. We've only been here about 175,000 years, so we're the babies. We represent only 0.5% of all the living biomass on the planet. We're currently, however, using 24% of the photosynthesis of the Earth. And we're headed from 6.8 billion to 9 billion, 10 billion people in the next 40 years.
Right.
So we may be using up to 50% of the photosynthesis, not sustainable. So either we're going to be challenged with our own extinction, or we're going to be facing the extinction of our fellow creatures, then our own extinction. We just have to turn the corner. Now, what's daunting, I think, to all of us is we've had two events, I think, in the last 18 months, which I believe signal the end game for the great industrial age, which was based on fossil fuels. And the first event, of course, was July of 2008. You remember in that month when oil peaked at 147 a barrel?
Yep, exactly.
And everyone panicked. There were food riots in 30 countries.
Mm-hmm.
Prices went through the roof, everything from foodstuffs to gasoline, because the whole industrial civilization is based on fossil fuels, construction materials, pharmaceutical products, food, fiber, power, etc. So when oil hit 147 a barrel, the prices went through the roof, and purchasing power plummeted across the world. What I'm saying is that was the great economic meltdown. That was the earthquake. The financial market collapse 60 days later was the aftershock, because we couldn't maintain that fiction, that delusion that we were growing an economy in a sustainable way, with all the debt, when the real economy went south, and the real economy is based on fossil fuels. This is what I call peak globalization, and what I think the listeners to grasp, at least this is my belief, we have hit the end game for the industrial age. It is over. This is peak globalization. We're never going to get through that wall of 147, 150 a barrel, and that's because of something called peak oil per capita.
Right, which is I just want to cut in for a second. That is an interesting notion that no one has been talking about. Peak oil per capita.
Right, very different than peak oil production, which people know about. That's peak oil production is when half the oil reserves of the world are used up. And there's some controversy about it. The optimists think maybe around 2025 or 30. The pessimists think sometime in the next decade. There really isn't much of an argument, because they're now down to arguing about 10 or 15 years, which is a pretty short time, a very short time to rethink the energy of all of civilization. But peak oil per capita is more interesting. There's no controversy. It occurred in 1979 at the height of the Second Industrial Revolution. If we distributed all the oil reserves we knew at that point in time to everyone living on the planet, that's the most each person could have. We found more oil since then, but population rose quicker. So if we distributed all the oil reserves we now know we have to 6.8 billion people, there's less per person to go around. So when China and India made their bid at a tremendous 10% growth rate to bring a third of the human race into the second industrial revolution, the demand pressure on supply was too great, and at 147 a barrel, the engine just turned off.
Right. And let me ask one question, just a clarification in there. When you say if we distributed all, that the two things on the sides of that equation are population and oil reserves.
Right.
When you say if you divide all the oil reserves today, that we know of today among all population, are you leaving out the fact that the oil reserves now seem to be harder to get to, more expensive, thus we're drilling a mile down in the ocean?
No. That's all the oil reserves we know. Absolutely, even the ones hard to get.
So I'm saying that in some sense, this is even worse than it looks, because we already got all the easy stuff.
Absolutely, and here's the bottom line: we're now trying to regrow the economy, and the economy is growing a little bit because we're replenishing inventories. But what's happening? As soon as we try to regrow the economy again, oil starts to go over $80 a barrel. So what I'm suggesting is every time we try to regrow this global economy by moving it again, getting the engine moving, the oil prices will continue to go up, and natural gas shadows oil prices, coal shadows natural gas. So every time we try to revitalize the global economy, the prices will go up, inflation will go up, and the economic engine will shut off at about 150 a barrel and keep collapsing back down. It's an end game. Right. There is no way to regrow it because the fossil fuel energies are sunsetting: coal, oil, natural gas, and uranium. They're not emerging energies. Their S curve is exhausted. Two, all the technologies of the 20th century are based on those energies, like the internal combustion engine, and they are old and outdated. And three, the whole infrastructure of civilization is made from those fuels, and it's on life support. Right. So I believe the industrial age truly is in an end game. That's number one. I think the second.
Let me ask you just one other thing for a listener or a critic to say. Well, you're talking about the 147 a barrel, and that we're going to keep bumping up against that limit. Some people have said that speculation has a lot to do with that. How does that factor in?
It does, but it only factors in on top of the real situation. You can't have speculation unless there's a real situation that allows the speculation to come in.
Right. So it might affect the top number or the speed at which we get to it. But it's speculation based on some reality. Let me tell people,
Absolutely.
by the way, I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Jeremy Rifkin about the ideas in his newest book, The Empathic Civilization. You can learn more at
EMPATHICCivilization.com.
The Empathic that's with the Empathic Civilization, one word.com. Okay, so the point we've gotten to so far is that the indicators are in that the fossil fuel-based industrial age is hitting its limits.
It's in the end game. Now, the second event is related, and if we fast forward to December 2009, Copenhagen.
Right.
192 countries come together to address the entropy bill for the industrial age, the spent CO2. 200 years of spewing carbon into the atmosphere, and now we're faced with climatic temperature change, which could affect our ability to survive on the planet. So here are our scientists who are saying that we could face at least a 3-degree centigrade rise in temperature on this Earth in the next century. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot until you understand that would take us back to the temperature on this planet 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. That was a completely different world.
So that's the last time we were at that same temperature that we're headed for. And you may give us more information, but basically the adjustments that we're even trying to make are not going to stop us short of probably 3, right?
No, not at all. And if we go only 2 to 3 degrees Celsius rise, and that's looking optimistic at this point, our scientists in the UN Climate Panel report, their models show we could lose upwards on the high end of 70% of all the assessed species of animal and plant life on this Earth by the end of the century at the earliest. Now, we've only had 5 waves of biological extinction on Earth in 450 million years in the geological record, and every time there was a mass wipeout, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. So, as my wife says, we're just not grasping the enormity of this moment. And when skeptics say this is seasonal, I'm amused because the Arctic has been impacted in ice for millions of years. We've had open Arctic waters in the summer for 4 years running. That is not seasonal.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah. I think the bottom line is Jim Hansen. He's our chief climatologist at the NASA Goddard Space Institute. He threw us a curve in Brussels because I advised the EU, and we were hoping to get the world to mitigate at 450 parts carbon per million by mid-century, and with the hope we'd only go up 2 degrees, which would be devastating, but maybe we could survive. Jim Hansen looked at the geological record with his team, and they said, well, we got the numbers wrong in Brussels. If we're going to try to mitigate at 450 parts carbon per million by mid-century, we don't go up 2 degrees. We go up 6 degrees, and this is a paraphrase of Jim Hansen's study, and the end of the human civilization as we've come to know and adapt to it.
Mm-hmm. So that's.
I hope they're all wrong, but my suspicion after almost 30 years with climate change is we've all continued to underestimate the feedback loops and the acceleration of climate change. I think we are really at a turning point for our species at this point.
Right, and 450, as you said, was your hope.
Right.
That you'd reach agreements that would limit to 450.
We'd have to go to 350. And
Bill McKibben and many others, say
no
350. But no one's doing that. And you didn't even get binding agreements to go to 450.
No, it completely collapsed. It was a complete joke in Copenhagen. And so here's the question that leads to this book. What is wrong with us, the human race?
Yeah.
No, seriously, what is wrong with us?
Why can't we see it and why can't we act?
Well, here's what I suspect. I think it goes beyond the question of finding a new global mechanism to regulate the economy of the world or new carbon targets. What I think is really happening here is that all of us are living off ideas about human nature and the meaning of the human journey. Old ideas that were spawned during the Enlightenment in the 18th and early 19th century at the beginning of the market economy and the nation-state era. And these ideas are toxic, dysfunctional, and wrong-headed, and completely incompatible with biosphere challenges in a globalizing world. So if you go back and look at history and you ask, how do we think about human nature and the world we live in, the church was pretty clear about it for 1,500 years. It was pretty clear. The church said you're born in sin, depraved. And if you want salvation, you wait for the next world in Christ. End of story. But then the Enlightenment philosophers came at the beginning of the market era and the nation-state era, and they came up with a set of ideas about human nature that was conveniently compatible with the new market capitalist economy. John Locke said that we're born tabula rasa, blank slate, but he did say we have a predisposition to acquire property. Someone should have caught him on that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then Adam Smith said, of course, the real drive is babies are born, and their drive is to seek autonomy and to pursue their individual self-interest. Jeremy Bentham, later the utilitarian philosopher, said babies are born to seek pleasure over pain. We're utilitarian. Charles Darwin said, no, every creature is born with a drive to reproduce their survival in a competitive world. And then finally, Sigmund Freud at the end of the 19th century said, no, little babies are born with an insatiable sexual appetite, and all of life is about extinguishing libido. So here's my question to all you listeners who are parents out there, all right, or grandparents. Is this what little babies are?
Yeah, go through that again. Yeah,
they're either depraved, born in sin, rational, calculating, detached, competitive, aggressive, predatory, utilitarian, materialistic, self-interested, and libido-driven. If that is truly what human nature is, we're likely doomed. Because I don't see any way 6.8 billion human beings are going to come together and create a sustainable, just, global society and economy and attend this biosphere on this planet if that's our true human nature.
And let me ask you a question on that one because it's a key point here, a key sort of fork in the road as to which we are. When you ask the question, is that what babies are? Is that a fair way to say, is that what human adults are?
Well, that's a good. You hit the crux of this. What we are finding, and that's laid the basis, the scientific basis for this book, for the Empathic Civilization. In the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a whole series of scientific breakthroughs under the radar screen among evolutionary biologists, neurocognitive scientists, child research development experts that are challenging these basic assumptions of the Enlightenment about human nature. And back in the early 90s, for example, scientists in Italy just accidentally discovered in primates, in macaque monkeys, something called mirror neurons. These are the so-called empathy neurons, and it turns out that many primates, all human beings, we believe elephants, dolphins, we're not sure about some of the other species, but all humans and some primates are actually not soft-wired for aggression or predatory behavior or materialism or utilitarianism. We are actually soft-wired for empathic distress. In other words, we are the most social of creatures. We have the biggest neocortex, and our primary drive is attachment, intimacy, sociability, cooperation. And when those drives aren't met in parenting, in schooling, in the culture of society, then the second, if they're repressed, those empathic drives, then the secondary drives come in with a vengeance, the substitution drives, the aggression, the violence, the narcissism, and the materialism. And so what we are discovering is Homo empathicus, and it has tremendous implications for rethinking politics, economic models, and governance. And empathy is a very, very, very difficult concept. It's empathy is both feelings and abstract reasoning in a very complex ensemble. Let me just, if I might, explain how it works with a baby.
Yeah, and I got some questions about empathy, but lay it out, and then we'll talk about it.
All
okay,
right.
And by the way, let me tell people, this is Jeremy Rifkin. We're talking about his book, The Empathic Civilization.
Well, you know, when babies are in a nursery and one baby cries, all the other babies will respond by crying. They just don't know why they're crying. That's empathic distress. It's in their neurons.
Now, let me ask. I mean, I'm sorry to keep stopping you, but these are questions that, as a critic, I go,
please.
What about the fact that they're just annoyed at the interruption that one baby's crying is doing? That it's a noise that causes them fear and irritation.
Yeah, they filtered that out, and
Okay.
I'll tell you how you can know it for yourself. That we are actually soft-wired for empathic distress, and that is to feel another being's experience as if we are feeling it ourselves vicariously. If a spider goes up someone else's arm and you're watching it, you're likely to feel that creepy feeling inside of you vicariously. If someone punctures himself and they bleed, you wince.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, we don't think about that, but that actually is our neural circuitry that allows us to react. An alligator doesn't do that. Mammals do.
Okay.
All right, and especially with more advanced neocortex. So that's empathic distress. Now, around 2.5 years of age, a child learns about their own self-identity in a mirror. They know that that's them. That allows a child to understand that another child, when they're experiencing another child's distress, they know it's coming from them, but that they're feeling it themselves, all right, because they're an individual. Around 8, a child learns about birth and death, and that's when a child learns that they have a one and only history. They come from mommy and daddy. They have a one and only life. One day they're going to die, that we're all fragile and vulnerable, that every moment's unrepeatable. It's that existential sense of one's individuality that goes with the maturing of empathy. So self-development go with empathy, and the reason is once I know I'm an individual being with a one and only life and I'm vulnerable and it's tough to be alive and my life could end at any moment, then it allows me to empathize with another individual's one and only life, their journey, their vulnerability. And so when I'm empathizing with another, and I'm sure your listeners can resonate with this, I feel their struggle to be. And I realize that they're trying to overcome the odds. It's tough being alive. They're struggling to flourish and be. And so I'm trying to show compassion to celebrate solidarity with them. So empathy has the whiff of death and the celebration of life. We understand that each of us is trying to flourish and be, and then we show compassion and solidarity for another's struggle to exist.
Now, let me ask a question there. So, in other words, it's when and when you pointed out these things that happen at 2.5 or happen at 7 or 8, you're saying cross-culturally that it isn't that they are told that or the culture holds that theory. It's that's when their brain and consciousness is able to grasp these concepts?
Able to, yes, but it evolves over history. If you take a forager-hunter society way back when, and this is where I would disagree with the Romantics who said we have to get back to the true goodness of our nature back in 100,000 years ago. Forager-hunter societies, even the ones that still exist in the world, they may be innocent, but they can't have mature empathy because there's no sense of the individual. There's no word for I.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a collective we. So there can be empathic distress and empathic distress in parenting, but the existential sense that I have a one and only life, that goes along with civilization and the increasing understanding of historical consciousness, for sure.
Okay.
Now, let me say that there's no empathy in heaven, and there's no empathy in utopia. So if anyone's planning on going to heaven, I can tell them in advance, no empathy up there because there's no mortality. There's no suffering. Same in utopia because suffering's been eliminated. Empathy is actually the opposite of utopian thinking because it's the understanding that we're all imperfect, we're all vulnerable, it's very tough to be alive, whether you're a human being or a fox in the wood, and we're constantly showing solidarity in our physical being by experiencing another's plight and rooting for them as if we were rooting for ourselves. So to me, an empathic civilization, the emergence of an empathic civilization, it's the opposite of utopia, but I'm much more comfortable in that kind of a society.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's solidarity. It's empathy is actually the social glue that allows us to come together in broader dimensions. Let me go back.
Let me throw a question in there,
sure,
and see if that helps. And you're going back. So it seems that we have this interesting thing that at first, I've read some Piaget and some development stuff. At first, we sort of don't know where our own boundaries are, and we kind of identify with mom and dad and things around us because that's all we know. It's all one. Then you're saying we develop the awareness that we are a self, that we are individual, and that helps us develop this empathic consciousness of someone else, and yet, what if it looks so much in our society that people get stuck at that self place, and thus rugged individualism, thus the ability to develop a capitalist society based on inequity, on getting mine, no matter what it does. How does that work?
What I'm saying to you is that's substitution. All of that idea that material, utilitarian, self-interested, aggressive, predatory behavior, that is substitution. Those are secondary drives. As you know in the book, in the Empathic Civilization, there's a lot of studies in there which are just mind-blowing. Because, see, we never knew what a baby was thinking before they were pre-verbal. Now we have these studies that are just incredible. For example, in one study, they have a piece of wood with two eyes glued on it, all right? And they have a bunch of little babies on the floor. They're not even walking or talking yet, all right? And they're watching this little piece of wood, two glued eyes, trying to get up a wood plane to the top, and it falls every time, all right? The second experiment, they show a second piece of wood with two glued eyes helping the first one up the plane. The third one, they show a hinder, a piece of wood with two glued eyes. Every time the first piece of wood tries to get up the plane, the third piece of wood stops it and throws it back. Then they let the babies go. All the babies scamper up to the helper. None of them go to the hinderer. How do they know to do that? I'll give you another experiment. At the Max Planck Institute in Germany, they took little 9, 10-month-old babies and sat them on the floor. And then one experiment, a man is trying to take books and hold on to them and collect them, and they fall accidentally. The second experiment, he throws the book on the floor. Experiment 2, he's trying to take clothes off a clothesline and hold on to them, and they accidentally fall. The second experiment, he throws them on the floor. When the clothes are thrown on the floor purposely, or the books are thrown on the floor purposely, the babies don't move. When the man is trying to hold on to the clothes or books and they accidentally fall, all the babies scamper up to help them.
Wow.
Yeah,
I remember that in the book, but there
are hundreds of these experiments now in the last 10 years.
So in other words, we still don't know. They can't tell us what they're thinking, but we have developed experiments that have shown us that what else is going on, but what you're describing. That in that
state,
their
basic drive.
Okay. And then what you're saying is the frustration of that drive leads them to the what you say, I guess, you call them the substitution drives, the drives for acquisitiveness, domination, those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And if you have poor parenting, corporal physical punishment, neglect, abuse, if your institutions, your schools, your business models, your governance are directed toward thwarting those drives, the secondary drives come in. We know this is the case. When we're old, I'm 65, and we look back on our lives, the moments that count for us are not the moments where we were predatory or competitive or beat somebody out or collected some more material gains. The moments we really look back as the photographic snapshots of our life were those empathic moments, sometimes unexpected, where we transcend ourselves and actually can experience another's plight as if it were ours and show solidarity with them and compassion and root for them. And those are the moments we remember when we look back on our life.
Yeah.
Those are the moments that children have, babies have, but it's not expressed yet. It's only in distress at the beginning of life. So here's the question I asked in the book. If we are empathic by nature, is it possible to imagine extending empathy to the human race as an extended family and to our fellow creatures as part of our evolutionary family and to the biosphere as our single community upon which we all depend? If it's possible to imagine that, then we might be able, I think, to save our species. I think if we can't even imagine that possibility, then I don't think we're going to make it. So the book was an attempt to ask this question: is there a process in history? Is there kind of a dialectical process, if you will? If there's a process in history, a mechanism in which consciousness changes and empathy evolves, because that's an alternative history to the one that we hear about, in our history books. So the historians didn't do me much good, because when the historians look at history, they chronicle pathology.
They really do. Yep.
The wars, the conquest, the exploitation, the redress of grievances. Why? Those are extraordinary events that get our attention. Why? Because they're not ordinary. So, but when you chronicle all of history with the extraordinary events that get our attention because they're monstrous or they're terrible, you get a pretty bad picture of the human race. But George Frederick Hegel said something that I remember from 30 years ago, which began this journey for me. He said, happiness are the blank pages of history. Mm-hmm. Those are the periods of harmony. So I went back and I looked at narrative from the first narrative with Gilgamesh, the Greek tragedies, the romance novels of the early modern era cinema, and you can see an alternative history. And let me, if I might, just lay out what I think that is. I think that the great changes in consciousness in history occur when two things happen. First, we change the way we organize the energy of the earth, and we've done that occasionally through history. And second, equally important, we create new communication revolutions to manage the new energy regimes we create. In other words, when we create new energy regimes, they make possible more complex living arrangements between people, but that increasing complexity requires new ways to communicate to manage that.
Sure.
When energy revolutions come together with communication revolutions, they change consciousness, they change history, and they change the way we empathize with one another. I'll give you examples.
Yeah, no, let me just tell listeners, I really like this. You're going to lay out like 2 or 3 or 4 of these moments when energy, communication, and consciousness all shift.
Right, and change history. If you look at forager-hunter societies, for most of our existence, we were foragers and hunters. That was the energy regime. In order to organize foraging and hunting, there had to be something called language, so people could socially coordinate their foraging and hunting activity. When every forager-hunter society in history that we've ever known about created mythological consciousness without exception. And they extended empathy only to blood ties, your basic kinship ties. If there was another tribe on another mountain, they were not human, all right? So empathy extended very narrowly to the communication energy revolution, the social framework that they had. When we go to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, for example, the Mesopotamians and Sumeria, they were the first to create high-end agriculture. So they took photosynthesis, and with centralized agriculture, they became the managers of surplus grains, cereal grains, wheat, rice, barley, etc. These big civilizations were very complicated. They had to indenture thousands of men for the first time in history to build the canals. Then they had to set up the dikes. They had to create craft skills, differentiation of labor. They had to create the royal granaries, the royal roads, distribution systems, and urban life. It was so complex, these hydraulic agricultural civilizations, these centralized civilizations, that they had to create writing. So everywhere they created these hydraulic civilizations, the Middle East, Indus Valley in India, China, and Mexico, and this is fascinating, independently, humans from some kind of writing, independently, to manage them. And every one of these hydraulic civilizations that we know of in the Middle East, India, and China shifted consciousness from mythological consciousness to theological consciousness. All the great religions formed then. The Abrahamic religions are called the people of the book. It was all based on writing. The Jewish religion, Christianity, Islam. Buddhism, based on script in India. And here again, empathy extends one more time. This time from blood ties to religious ties, which is a fictional family. So now all Jews think of all other Jews as family. It's a fictional family. It's not based on blood ties, but they empathize with each other. Then Christians began to see other Christians as brothers and sisters. It's a fictional family. They empathize with them, and Muslims, etc.
Okay, so let me I just want to go through it one. So the energy changes because the energy at that point, so much of it is agriculture. As you say, that's photosynthesis. Right. To do that, society and communication change. Right. To manage it, and we don't know exactly why, but what happens then is consciousness changes and empathy changes. I would imagine that when you make religion a central defining point of who you are as a self in relationship to that religion, then of course that changes how you identify the other as well.
Well, and also, to be frank about it, the monotheistic religions fit centralized agriculture. You had, instead of a whole lot of fertility gods and goddesses, you have one centralized god, first a sun god, then a monotheistic god in the heavens overlooking the earth, just as in these centralized agricultural civilizations, you had a pharaoh centralized and overlooking the energy communication regime, which was centralized. It fit pretty well.
Very well. Okay, next one.
First Industrial Revolution, another convergence of communication energy. Print technology became very cheap in the 19th century with steam power, linotype and rotary. Then we introduced public schools and mass literacy in Europe and America between 1830 and 1880 and created a print-literate mind that could then manage coal, steam, and rail, communication and energy. We could not have managed the coal, steam, and rail first Industrial Revolution with codex, too slow. Finally, the 20th century, the second Industrial Revolution, first-generation electricity, the telegraph, telephone, cinema, radio, TV, etc., became the communication revolution to manage the oil and internal combustion engine era. Now, what happened in the 19th and 20th century is consciousness changed. In the 19th century, first Industrial Revolution, we went to ideological consciousness, the Enlightenment, challenging theological consciousness. In the 20th century, when we went to electricity to organize the internal combustion engine era, the oil age, we went from ideological consciousness to psychological consciousness. So our generations, we think therapeutically. My grandmother couldn't think psychologically. She could think ideologically or theologically or even mythologically, but she couldn't think psychologically. Now, how did empathy extend itself? Very interesting. When we went to the market economy and the nation-state era, the first Industrial Revolution, with ideological consciousness, empathy extends to a new family called national loyalty. So all of a sudden, there's something called Germany or the United States or Italy. These are fictions. Mm-hmm. They're fictional governance, but now all of a sudden all Germans think of other Germans as family and empathize, but not with the Italians. Italians think of themselves as family and empathize, but maybe not with Americans. So what happens is empathy extends to the new boundaries of the energy communication revolution we create, because it's a way for human beings to extend their solidarity and create social bonds beyond blood ties. So really the question I'm asking in the empathic civilization is the second question. If we've seen a spotty history, it's not linear, there are a lot of blowbacks, terrible periods in history, but we see a kind of a jerky history of going from blood ties in terms of empathy to religious associations, family becomes religion with empathy, to national loyalties, we start to empathize with our national boundaries. Is it possible now, on the cusp of a globalizing world, to extend empathy beyond the blood ties and religious ties and national ties and begin to empathize with our fellow human beings, our fellow creatures living in a biosphere boundary?
Okay, let me ask a question.
I think it's possible to imagine, at least.
Yes. Let me ask a question about, at that point that we are identifying with nation states, with nations. Where does the racial and the role of the immigrant fit in this, where we have this thing where I feel solidarity with my nation, but I'm not so sure about you because you're a different color. How does that how does that fit in this?
I think where it fits in is that every stage is not clean and pure. In other words, it has the whenever a new boundary is created with new energy communication revolutions, extending the boundary, extending the ability to come together in more diverse ways with more diverse populations. Empathy is the social glue that allows people to come together, but then the old identities are threatened, the ones based on blood ties, racial ties, religious ties. That's where you get the populist blowback, the xenophobism, the tribal reassociations. That happens through history. So the most dangerous periods in history is when an old energy communication regime is dying on life support, and a new energy communication regime is being born that allows us to broaden our sense of identity and bring more people together in more complex arrangements. The old identities are very threatened, and I believe that's happening now. And as you know, the last part of the book, I talk about the emergence of a new energy communication revolution,
right,
a third industrial revolution, which is shifting the boundaries, and that may have a lot to do with why there's so much blowback and xenophobism out there.
Okay, that makes sense. In other words, it's at the, and this I believe, Jeremy, say if I'm right, this seems to happen in physical, in physics, in chemistry, etc., that the moments of transition are the most volatile, the most chaotic, etc. And that's
absolutely, yes.
And so we can say right now we're at one of those, and so at the one point, and I'll let you go into because I like what you say about the next revolution. But so at a moment when our need is to be more inclusive and widen our boundary, in other words, to handle our technology, to handle our population, we're having a difficulty doing that, and that is much of what is our what we call a clash of civilizations, what we have immigration problems in the U.S., in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that tension and that chaos at the moment of transition.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous moment when that happens between civilizations. And now I think the dangers are really very extreme today. I believe we're on the cusp of a new energy communication revolution. I don't know if we'll get there in time, but it could extend the boundaries from blood ties to religious ties to national ties to what we would call from mythological consciousness to theological to ideological, psychological. I think we're on the cusp of biological consciousness.
And
that is extending our boundaries to the biosphere.
And this biological consciousness, what you're also saying, you're saying it's possible, and you're going to tell us how it fits into this cyclical thing that you're talking about. But you're also, I think we both agree, that it's the consciousness that's necessary to handle the scale of our technology and, as you point out, entropy, climate change, carbon, pollution, which is the price, the cost of what we achieved so far, that the scale of our power now demands a leap of consciousness. And you're saying that tell us about this third industrial revolution.
Well, we've had a very powerful communication revolution in the last 15 years, the personal computer and the Internet. And what's so interesting about this second generation communication electricity is it's so different from the first. The first was centralized, radio, TV, cinema, etc., telegraph and telephone. It was centralized top-down electricity communication. The computer, personal computer and the Internet is what we call distributed communication. And that is now billions of people, literally several billion people, can take their own video, audio, and text and send it to each other and to all 2 billion other people at the speed of light in a distributed fashion with the more power than the BBC. So this distributed ICT revolution, information communication revolution, is just now in Europe beginning to converge with a new energy regime, distributed energy. And when distributed communication technology organizes distributed energies, we have a powerful third industrial revolution that might get us to biosphere consciousness. And so if I could, I'll lay it out for a minute or two.
Yeah, please do. This is Jeremy Rifkin. We're talking about the ideas in the empathic civilization. You can learn more at theempathiccivilizaton.com or org.
.com.
.com. You can learn more about all of this.
Empathic civilization. You don't have to put the V in there.
Okay, empathiccivilizaton.com. Go ahead.
I was privileged to develop the long-term economic game plan, the Third Industrial Revolution plan for the EU. It's our formal plan. And, of course, when people, sometimes dismiss the EU, but it is the largest economy in the world. And it's the GDP of the 27 member states of the EU eclipses the GDP of our 50 states. So it's a powerful player. We developed a Third Industrial Revolution, and we're just now in the last 18 months, beginning to roll it out across the regions and cities and countries in Europe. It's far different than anything we're experiencing here in the U.S. So let me lay it out for the listeners and see what they think. It's based on 4 pillars, an infrastructure of 4 pillars that have to be laid down simultaneously in every region. Pillar 1 is the EU's committed to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That's a third of the electricity in Europe. These are distributed energies. The reason we call them distributed is unlike elite energies, coal, oil, gas, uranium, those are elite energies because they're centralized and they're only found in a few places. So you have to have a huge military investment to secure them, big geopolitical investment to control them, massive capital to organize them from the top down. But those energies are sunsetting, and the technologies are old, the infrastructure is on life support. Distributed energies are distributed because they're found in everyone's backyard, the sun, the wind, the heat under the ground, water for hydroelectricity, rural agricultural waste, municipal garbage, the ocean tides. These energies are distributed because they're found in some proportion in every square inch of the world. So the EU is committed to Pillar 1, distributed renewable energies. It's a mandate. A third of the electricity has to be renewable in 10 years. Then Pillar 2, we face the problem, how do we collect these energies? And the first thing we thought of was, let's go to the Mediterranean because that's where all the sun is, and we'll grab it up and then put a big supergrid in and send it across Europe, and then we'll go to Ireland where all the wind is off the coast there, centralize it and send it to Europe, and then the Norwegians will have the hydro. I don't oppose centralized solar and wind, et cetera, but that's 20th century thinking based on the old energies that were found in only a few places. So you centralize them and control them from the top down.
So even though you're talking about renewable energies, a good step in the right direction, you're talking about a decentralized approach to it, which is old thinking.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is that if you look at the Obama plan out of Washington, whatever little stuff they're having in renewables, it's centralized. In Europe, it's distributed. So,
and I think this is the thing that people will be amazed to hear. How do you, on a massive enough scale to make a difference, decentralize the collection and distribution of energy?
Well, Pillar 2 is buildings. Buildings. Buildings are the number one cause of climate change, 40% of the energy, 40% of the CO2. Parenthetically, the number 2 cause of climate change, which we never talk about in this country, is beef production and consumption and animal husbandry. Number 3 is worldwide transport. So I'm often surprised when President Obama takes his Friday lunch breaks at his favorite hamburger place with his vice president. Either he's not knowledgeable about the number 2 cause of climate change or doesn't care. But I'm sure if he got in a Hummer and drove down to the hamburger joint, people would be talking.
Exactly.
But anyway, buildings are the solution. What we envision in Europe is we're beginning this process of transforming every single existing building, home, office, factory, technology park, industrial building, into a partial power plant that collects the distributed energy on site, the sun, the wind, the heat under the ground, etc. This will jumpstart an economic revolution in Europe because it's always about construction. So we see our dwellings now as both a dual purpose. They're both a dwelling and they're your own personal power plant. And that jumpstarts an economic revolution for Europe. Because all the workforce has to be local, and it'll take 30 years to convert these buildings.
Okay, in other words, I've heard about where you do that in a building, you do that in a home, you collect, you send it back to the grid, you get paid for what you return to the grid the same way you get charged for what you take from the grid. Buildings makes more sense because they've got the money maybe for the return on investment. how are you talking about retrofitting the old ones so that they actually do
all
this?
the old ones, because 70% of the real estate stock in Europe will still be there in 2030.
Okay, so the only way to make this shift is to build new ones so that they do this, and you're going to tell us that there are buildings that do already that are positive energy providers.
Right, what I'm saying is we convert all the old buildings to do a little partial power. Every building can be converted to do a little bit of solar, a little bit of wind.
Right.
Old buildings. We're doing that across Europe. The new buildings they're up now in Spain. They're positive power. And they're starting to come up across Europe this year. They actually create more power than they use. So
wonderful.
That's pillar 2.
Yep.
Pillar 3 is we have to find a way to store these energies because the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. These are intermittent energies. So we've introduced an 8 billion euro rollout to put hydrogen in as a way to store renewable energy. So when the sun is shining on your building, you generate electricity. If you have some surplus you're not using, you electrolyze water. The hydrogen comes out in a tank. And then when the sun isn't on the roof, you convert it back to electricity. Yes, it's an energy loss, but that's the second law of thermodynamics. You always lose energy when you convert. And if you look at the loss of energy when you convert coal, oil, gas, and uranium from the point you mine it to the point you get it, it's astronomical compared to hydrogen as storage. Then pillar 4. This is the most interesting pillar. This is where the distributed communication revolution converges with distributed energy to give us a third industrial revolution and what we hope will be biosphere consciousness. We take the same technology that created the Internet, identical, and we're taking the power grid of Europe and transforming it into an intergrid that acts exactly like the Internet. So when millions and millions and millions of buildings across Europe are producing just a little bit of their own distributed renewable energy, storing it in hydrogen, like you store digital in media, and then what they don't need, they can share across an intergrid that crosses the entire European continent. This is what we call power to the people. It's distributed power. And the fourth pillar then connects in because all of the distributed energy will be connected to utility outlets for plug-in vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles so that you can either send energy back to the grid, take energy off the grid. Everyone becomes their own energy player. But it also requires a social model, not only an entrepreneurial model, because the energy has to be shared across a continent. So it requires that you think continental and act local and set up energy cooperatives to share this. Think Internet. It's taking the idea of collaborative social spaces on the Internet and marrying them with collaborative energy spaces across the continent. And the only reason we can do this, we couldn't do this up until 8 years ago. You know, for 30 years, governments would say, Mr. Rifkin, how are you going to run the world on windmills and solar roofs? Not practical. They're soft energy. They have a place, but you can't run the world on
right.
it. You have to have nuclear power and coal and oil and gas. We really couldn't answer that question for 30 years. Now we can. 7 or 8 years ago, the software industry came up with the second generation IT. It's called Grid IT, IT 2.0. We now have software that allows us to connect hundreds of thousands or even millions of little desktop computers
right.
that don't have much power. But when you connect those hundreds of thousands of little desktop computers, the distributed computing power exceeds by a magnitude anything you could get for centralized supercomputers. So we can take that grid IT to the transmission lines. When millions and millions of buildings across Europe are producing just a little bit of their own distributed energy, storing it with hydrogen, like storing digital and media, and then what you don't need, sharing it through energy cooperatives and open sourcing across the continent, the actual distributed power exceeds anything you could ever imagine with a nuclear-fired power plant or coal power plant.
And is that leap from distributing bits of information, electronic information, to actual electronic energy, is that leap a big one, a small one, a simple one, a thing of which there are obstacles we still have to overcome? How equivalent are those two methods of distribution?
It's difficult, but for a generation that's grown up on the Internet, that's now used to being empowered to create their own information and sharing it in collaborative, open source commons, the idea that they should now be able to be empowered to create their own energy and share it across energy commons should be an easy fit.
Well, you're talking about the human software. I'm talking about just the technology.
Well, let me get to that in a minute, but let me focus it by saying, then I'll get to the technology. We think this creates biosphere consciousness, because when everyone's responsible for their swath of the biosphere, right where they live, for the energy, the photosynthesis, etc. But then we have to share that energy across continents. Then we begin to realize we're as interconnected in the ecosystems that make up the biosphere as we are connected in the blogosphere and in cyberspace. That creates biosphere consciousness, and the kids in the schools are already learning this. If you go into any school system in this country or in Europe, the kids are learning that everything they do, the electricity they use, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the family car, has a carbon footprint that affects some other human being or some other creature somewhere else on the planet. That's biosphere consciousness. But now we have to have an economic revolution that goes with it, and then we're going to have to rethink the human condition in terms of our schooling, our parenting, and our governing models. And if you're asking, can it be done? On May 31st, for example, we have a global team that I chair of IT companies and utility companies, logistics, transport, and cooperatives. We brought the World Cooperative Associations together with companies because we see this as a social market model. On May 31st, we're going to roll out an entire 40-year master plan for the great city of Rome, the great city of Western civilization, to become the first post-carbon city. And we're now doing regions, and we're working with whole countries. And so in Europe, we're just beginning in the last 12 months, and it's doable, it's difficult, it's challenging, but we don't see a plan B, because if we continue to rely on the second industrial revolution, whose energies are sunsetting, technologies are old, the whole damn system's on life support, we're going to keep throwing money against a system that's on life support. We're going to be in deeper trouble in 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now.
Okay, the thing that gives me hope is not that the old fogies are going to shift to this consciousness. Some of them will, but most of them may not. But that the children who grow up, as you say, who have grown up in the Internet, who will grow up in these systems, are the ones that I think have a chance of having that consciousness. So if we look 20, 30 years in the future, you know, as they have with so many other things, whether it's race or gender or things, the divisions their parents see, kids don't see anymore. So I think that's what gives me hope. The current economic crisis in the EU and the fact that climate change is likely to intensify conflict as water becomes more scarce and these sorts of things, how do those two things, I'm giving you only 2 minutes, counter what you're saying?
Well, what we have to do, people say to me, where are you going to find the money? And, you know, right now, the economy's shot, unemployment's high, deficits are running high, debt's running high. How are you going to afford this? Well, in our economic development plans that we're laying out in Europe, what we do if we go into a country or a city or region, we're saying, look, you spend a certain amount of money anyway each year on economic development and, you know, new factories or bridges or infrastructure or transport or whatever. So if you only take a very small percentage, say 1%, 1.5% of what you would spend anyway on shoring up an old second industrial revolution infrastructure that's clearly on life support with old energies, if you just dedicated maybe 1%, 2%, depending on the city, region, or country, to the new infrastructure of laying down renewable energies, transforming your buildings to power plants, putting in hydrogen storage, setting up smart grids, and plug-in vehicle transport, if you do that each year systematically across a region, within 20 years, you can wean off the old second industrial revolution infrastructure that's dying and into the emerging third industrial revolution that would get us to a post-carbon world and hopefully save our species. I don't know if we'll get there in time. I really don't.
Right.
I think the plan makes sense. I think we're beginning to shift to biosphere consciousness, but I think the younger generation's ready. I just don't know in terms of the race against the clock, but none of us do.
Right. I think that what we see happening in Europe, where you're having your success right now, is a fraying of the empathy they already felt when they went into a European Union and so on. And so I think there's a test, and maybe it is exactly that test that happens at the transition phase, you know, the volatility and the difficulty. That we would talk about if we had more time, but we don't. The book is The Empathic Civilization. The website is empathiccivilizaton.com. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by linking to the podcast. You can also sign up to have it delivered to you weekly, either at my website, terencemcnally.net, TerenceMcNally, terencemcnally.net, or at iTunes. You can also sign up to have a weekly announcement sent to you telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and a little bit of background on the issues, either at the site or by emailing me at TEMcNally, TEMcNally, mac.com. Thank you to Melissa Figueroa, my engineer, and to you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week. Jeremy Rifkin, thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.